A hush had settled over King's Landing long before the rumors began, and that hush was itself an omen. The capital of the Seven Kingdoms was rarely ever silent. It seethed with life day and night, fishmongers along the wharves touting their slimy wares at dawn, gold cloaks barking orders in the markets by midday, tavern fires burning rowdy and loud by sundown. Yet now, throughout the city, the customary din had dulled into a nervous quiet. Folk walked quickly along the narrower streets, tucking their chins into their cloaks as though to hide from the weather, but the sky was bright and the air was stifling. Summer had come hot this year, boiling away the dampness of spring. The dryness that followed turned the accumulation of filth in the streets into choking dust. Some said it was just the usual discomfort of the season, but superstitious whispers claimed the dryness was some ill omen from the gods. At first, the hush was merely an incidental quiet that settled after a few strange deaths in Flea Bottom. Rumors spread in the small hours of the night, carried on by washerwomen, beggars, and urchins scurrying across the streets, speaking of coughs that turned throats raw, of a fever so high it took men's wits in the space of a single day, of bodies found twisted and stiff at dawn. Yet such stories had surfaced 100 times before. King's Landing was no stranger to disease. The city was an overcrowded pit of refuse, said many lords who rarely set foot in the streets. Illness bubbled up from the sewers, from the harbor, from the tanneries along the Blackwater, from the piles of waste in the poorer districts. The small folk often died in droves, and most of the realm paid no heed. But this time the hush grew. A swirl of rumor reached the Red Keep, traveling from the underbelly of the city, up through the hill that housed the Street of Steel and the Street of Silk, creeping over the mosaic floors of the Great September, and winding its way past the gilded gates into the keep where the king and his council resided. A handful of lesser lords and visiting merchants from Lys arrived, pale-faced and tight-lipped, with second-hand stories of a new plague across the narrow sea. They carried word that this pestilence had struck in Pentos and Myr, that it had found its way into the slums of Volantis, and that it traveled by ships. No one was certain if it was the same sickening rumor that spread through the wards of Flea Bottom, but the timing was suspicious. Courtiers whispered to one another in corners, anxious that, if the plague had truly come, it might soon creep into the Great Keep. The king's small council was initially dismissive. After all, it was in the crown's interest to maintain calm. The Red Keep would stay vigilant but continue with business as usual. Additional gold cloaks were dispatched to quell any unrest should the small folk panic. A new line of peddlers arrived at the gates of the keep, bringing in fresh produce from the Reach, casks of arbor wine, and sweet pastries from the Stormlands, as though to prove life remained normal. Still, that hush persisted. In the southern wards, close to the Dragon Pit, a man lay dying in his home. His name was Rennies, a blacksmith's assistant, sinewy of arm and quietly proud of his work. He had collapsed into a fever 2 days past, and a day after that he began coughing red flecks into his hand. He raged at night, thrashing in his bed, delirious with swirling nightmares of men with hollow eyes. The local wise woman, old Cass, who had birthed half the children in that ward, said she had never seen a fever take hold so swiftly. Every hour that Rennie stayed alive seemed a marvel, but each hour also brought deeper torment. By evening of the second day, his cough was hacking out thick rivulets of blood, and his breath had turned to a rattle. Cass shook her head, powerless to help. "He's gone, poor soul. Let him go peacefully," she muttered, wiping her brow. But the man did not go peacefully. He screamed in agony as though devoured by invisible flames, so loudly that the entire street shrank from his voice. When his lungs gave out near midnight, the hush returned. The next morning, another man on the same street began to cough. Talk of revolt began around the same time. It always simmered in Flea Bottom when the cost of bread soared, or when the newly arrived gold cloaks demanded bribes to look the other way. But the talk grew louder amid these new rumors of sickness. A group of angry small folk cornered a pair of gold cloaks in the alley behind a brothel, accusing them of taking coin to let diseased travelers slip in from the wharves. The gold cloaks denied it, of course, but the tension flared in a burst of violence. By dawn, Men and women in Flea Bottom were muttering that someone in the Red Keep had let the disease creep in to quell the poor, that it was part of some vile scheme. Such ideas flared in the hearts of the desperate. When people are backed into corners by hunger and by fear, they look for an enemy. In King's Landing, that enemy was usually the Crown. A bitter wind from Blackwater Bay brought the stench of the city's emptiness. Ships still moved in the harbor, but fewer each day, as captains whispered of disease on the docks. The city guard attempted to crack down on suspected plague ships, but controlling maritime traffic into King's Landing was easier said than done. Bribes changed hands constantly. A lesser officer on the docks could be swayed to look away for a single silver stag. The crews themselves were often hungry enough to bend rules. Inside the Red Keep, the king's face remained calm and impenetrable in public, but behind closed doors, he was seething with a mixture of worry and frustration. He had inherited a precarious throne from his predecessor, and the city had never fully recovered from the last war. Rumors of the plague, real or not, were poison to his rule. People were frightened, and frightened people were prone to unrest. It did not help that in the streets, a rabble-rouser who named herself Marta the Grey started preaching in small squares, proclaiming the monarchy had failed the poor. She told tales of how the king's gold was spent lavishly on feasts while children starved, and how the gods were punishing the city with sickness. Panic was a plague in its own right, creeping faster than any fever. It took barely 3 weeks for the hush to darken into an outright chill. Cases of the strange cough were no longer restricted to Flea Bottom. A black-haired seamstress on the Street of Silk was discovered near death, her eyes gone yellow, her cheeks sunken, her bed soaked with sweat. A butcher on the Street of Flower indulged in a violent fit of coughing before toppling face first into a bloody slab of mutton. His apprentice found him there, convulsing, and by the time help arrived, he had breathed his last. Then more stories poured in. Men spitting black bile, women trembling with fevers that burned out their eyes, entire families dead within days. At first, these seemed like grotesque exaggerations. Yet the gold cloaks sent to investigate found unburied corpses, unholy stench, entire shanties of rotting bodies. The plague was real and it was spreading. The king's small council convened in the great hall, shutting out all but a handful of attendants. Maesters from the citadel, each wearing their chain links of silver, iron, and Valyrian steel, were summoned to give counsel. They brought pouches of herbs, phials of poppy extract, potions that might ease fevers, and instructions for quarantining the sick. But quarantining the sick in a city as large and unclean as King's Landing was nearly impossible. The population swelled with refugees from the outlying regions seeking royal protection, though none was truly offered. Crowded tenements and narrow streets meant that disease traveled as swiftly as rumor. The king listened grimly to his counsel. Some lords proposed shutting the city gates entirely, turning away all travelers, locking down each district behind guarded barricades. Others argued that such harsh measures would only spark the fear into full-blown revolt, for the small folk were already suspicious that the crown might let them die. The city needed food and trade to survive, and trade required open gates. It was a deadlock. They bickered for hours, their voices echoing in the great hall, but no consensus was reached. Eventually, the king, in a moment of frustration, rose from his seat with a scowl and commanded them to do what was necessary to preserve the health of the realm, without strangling trade or inciting riots. A near impossible directive, and everyone in that chamber knew it. Within days, tensions escalated. The gold cloaks grew harsher, fearing that if they let the city slip into chaos, the blame would fall on them. They began punishing minor crimes with severity, flogging bread thieves, running through pickpockets with steel, beating the small folk who dared throw stones at them. Shouts of murderers and bastards echoed through the poorer streets, and in some places, the men of the city watch were forced to retreat or be overwhelmed. A feverish mania seized some of the infected, who cursed the crown with their last breaths. Religious zealots, in turn, claimed this was the gods' punishment for the immoral city. Tensions built upon tensions, stoked by the plague's horrifying spread. Before the first month was out, The official count from the citadel's maesters had soared into the hundreds of dead. Unofficially, thousands more lay piled in the corners of Flea Bottom, abandoned in the dark corners of the city. As the death toll rose, the number of whispered conspiracies climbed in equal measure. A rumor flared up that the king had employed alchemists to concoct some vile brew to keep the small folk weak. Another rumor insisted that the plague came not from across the sea, but from some hidden store of wildfire beneath the city that had tainted the water. Each rumor found easy believers among those who had lost family and had nowhere to turn in their grief and anger. Among the frightened small folk, a figure in a tattered gray cloak quickly rose to prominence. Marta the Grey, who had begun preaching months ago. She was not a septa. She had no formal position within the faith, yet people listened to her. She had a sharpness in her dark eyes that lent her words a fiery conviction. She spoke not only of the gods but also of justice, claiming that the king's negligence had doomed the poor to die. More and more, her gatherings became open calls for revolt. "The great sickness is upon us," she said at one gathering in an alley near the Street of Flower, "and the king does nothing but sup on roast swan. We must tear him from his perch so the realm may heal." The crowd roared with savage approval. Many were sick themselves or had seen loved ones die. Their fury was a tinderbox. The king's spies dutifully reported Marta's speeches to the council. Some lords demanded her head. Others cautioned that arresting her outright might only stoke more unrest, turning her into a martyr. The king, vexed beyond measure, decided to send a discreet group of goldcloaks to silence Marta's gatherings, either by intimidation or silver, whichever worked best. But attempts to bribe her failed, and intimidation only galvanized her followers to protect her with their lives. A skirmish broke out in the heart of Flea Bottom, leaving 2 goldcloaks dead and a furious crowd chanting curses at the Iron Throne. From that point on, Marta found sanctuary among the poorest wards, always moving, always speaking. She warned the watchers, "Our city is full of devils in gold cloaks, devils who serve a throne that would watch us die. Fight or perish." All the while, the plague sank deeper into every corner of King's Landing. Streets that had once echoed with merchants and performers fell silent. Shops shuttered, not from a royal decree, but from fear or illness. The noise of commerce gave way to the coughs and wails of the dying. Some folk prayed the hot weather would stifle the sickness, while others prayed for a torrential rain to wash away the filth. Neither came. The heat lingered, stifling and oppressive. The dust kicked up by passing carts left throats parched and lungs irritated, making men and women fear every rasp might be the start of the plague. A new wave of refugees tried to flee the city, piling onto ships or slipping through the gates at dawn, only to find that the countryside was not much safer. In the Crownlands, rumors spread that the plague had reached smaller towns, carried by travelers from King's Landing. Many of those towns were turning back any who came from the city, at times with open violence. At the harbors, ships that accepted passengers from King's Landing found themselves turned away at foreign ports. The capital was becoming a pariah. The king had dispatched ravens to the lords of Westeros pleading for assistance, but fear of contagion made them cautious. Few offered immediate help. By the 2nd month of the outbreak, there were riots in Flea Bottom, in the Dragon Pit Ward, and even near the Great September itself. The City Watch, led by a knight who was rumored to be the king's cousin, managed to contain some of these outbursts through brute force. But each crackdown left behind dozens of bodies in the streets and hundreds more outraged survivors. Graffiti began appearing in corners of the city that read, "Death to the King," or "All must burn." The plague was a terror for everyone, but the crown's inability to protect its people or provide healing made it a target of blame. Small folk told each other, "If they will not save us from the plague, then we must save ourselves." And the fastest route to salvation, they believed, was through revolt. The hush that had once marked the city was transforming into an undercurrent of riotous energy that pulsed through the cramped alleys. In the Red Keep, the king stood upon a balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay, his hands gripping the stone railing. He was a middle-aged man, tired beyond his years. The dryness that had plagued the city left the waters calm and eerily dark. His breath fogged in the scorching air, not from cold but from the depth of his own ragged exhalations. He could see the narrow sprawl of the streets below, the labyrinth of rooftops and chimneys. Even from this vantage, he sensed the tension crackling in the city. Smoke rose in twisting spirals from various quarters where people burned refuse and the bodies of the dead. The king closed his eyes, remembering stories of the Targaryen era, of dragons scorching entire districts to quell rebellion or plague. He had no dragons, only men, and men were fallible, easily turned against him. He found his master of whispers waiting in a dim corridor. That man, gaunt and solemn, wore the black and green doublet of a minor house, but there was no question of his status. He was the king's ear in the dark corners of the city. The king asked him quietly, "How bad is it?" "Worse by the day," the master of whispers replied. "The small folk are convinced you do not care. Marta the Grey's hold is strengthening. There are rumors of gatherings at night, entire squares lit by torch where she preaches that your rain must fall." The king scowled. "Have we identified her allies among the lords or ladies?" "None among the highborn, but the faith is fracturing. Some sparrows are aligning themselves with her, seeing her as a prophet of the god's wrath. If the septas or the new high septon sympathize with them, we may have a deeper problem. We will hold a new session of the council. The faith must remain loyal," the king muttered. But a note of exhaustion weighed on his words. "And the plague? How many died last night?" The master of whispers gave a pained grimace. "400 at least. It is only an estimate, your grace. The real number is likely higher. Corpses litter the lower districts. Pyres burn at all hours." The king braced himself against the cold stone of the corridor. If it continues like this, there will be no city left to govern. To address the plague more directly, the king requested that the citadel's grandest maester be brought from Old Town, if possible. Ravens were sent, pleading for an archmaester with knowledge of healing. In the meantime, the local maester in King's Landing did what he could, setting up an infirmary near the dragon pit. It was quickly overwhelmed. Desperate masses came to beg for a remedy, any remedy, and the maester had no proper cures. He administered potions of nightshade, mustard plasters, boiled concoctions of basilisk blood, though that was rumored more for show than genuine effect. The truth was that no one truly knew how to stop the plague, not with the city's squalid conditions and the unending flow of new victims. In those makeshift infirmaries, the moans of the afflicted echoed across the stone walls, blending with the shrill pleas of mothers whose children lay limp with fever. The stench was enough to force many to retch at the door, for inside the cramped wards, the air felt weighed down by the exhalations of the dying. Some wounded men, infected or not, had nowhere to go for help and collapsed in corners, receiving only a bowl of stale water, if they were fortunate. Rumors sprang up again, that the maester's potions were a lie, that the real cure was withheld for the king and his cronies, that the only reason the wealthy were not dying in droves was that they possessed some secret elixir. The more the plague raged, the more resentful the poor became. Amid this misery, Marta the Grey's following multiplied. She moved like a wraith through the city, never staying in one place for long. Her messages were scrawled on walls, or whispered from one ear to the next in the back rooms of taverns. She promised that the crown's downfall was close at hand, that a new order would arise, guided by justice and, of course, the god's will. Zealous men and women began to appear at her gatherings armed with crude weapons, daggers, clubs, sharpened bits of scrap metal. The talk was not just of overthrowing the king but also of punishing anyone who stood in their way. Smaller revolts ignited like sparks in the night. One day, a group of armed smallfolk attacked a grain storehouse, claiming that the king kept hidden reserves for the lords while the poor starved. Another day, a squad of the city watch was ambushed and killed, their bodies left hanging from an archway with words painted in blood. Thus, for the king's dogs, the city had become a battlefield of illusions and sickness, and no man could guess which would claim more lives, the plague or the violence. Lord Tiber, a noble of moderate influence on the small council, decided to ride into the heart of the city with a retinue of knights, carrying wagons of bread to distribute. He believed that if the crown showed compassion, they might quell the growing unrest. For a moment it worked. People flocked to the wagons in droves. But the crowd grew unruly. Starving men and women bellowed for more than a single loaf. Fights broke out, and the knights tried to restore order. In the commotion, someone hurled a stone that struck one of the knights in the head. The knights responded by drawing swords. Within moments, a riot erupted. The bread distribution turned into a bloodbath, and Lord Tiber and half his retinue were forced to retreat. Rumor among the small folk said they had snatched the bread away and run, even though the official accounts would later claim they tried to keep distributing until forced back by violence. Regardless, trust in the crown's attempts at aid diminished even further. As the weeks dragged on, the king's nightmares grew frequent. He dreamt of a city in flames, of plague-ridden bodies. Storming the gates of the Red Keep, chanting Marta's name, breaking through windows, setting tapestries alight. In his dreams, he fled down hidden passages, but the infection found him, turning his lungs to rot. He would wake in a cold sweat, alone in his bedchamber, with only the moonlight to remind him the night was real. Even awake, he could not quell a deepening sense of doom. The small council was pressured into choosing extreme measures. They considered blocking off Flea Bottom entirely, posting guards at each exit to quarantine the worst of the plague. The king reluctantly ordered it so. Barricades of heavy lumber and iron spikes were erected, manned by gold cloaks armed with crossbows. Anyone who tried to leave Flea Bottom without proper clearance was to be turned back, or shot if they resisted. The city's lowest quarter became an open-air prison, where disease festered with no respite. The gold cloaks patrolled the perimeter day and night, sometimes shooting at any who came too close. The small folk in Flea Bottom, outraged, saw that the king had chosen to let them die like rats. Angry letters from certain septons and noble ladies poured in, condemning the cruelty. Even some lords balked at the strategy. But it was done, and in an eerie echo of the king's earlier attempt to preserve order without inciting a full revolt, it only inflamed the talk of rebellion further. Within Flea Bottom's barricaded streets, the plague raged like wildfire. It was said that after just a few days, the stench alone was enough to make strong men faint. Water was scarce and turned brackish. Disease spread from hovel to hovel, unstoppable. The sick died in the gutters or on rotting straw pallets, or sometimes in the arms of their loved ones. Cries for help went unanswered. If any tried to scale the barricades, the gold cloaks' crossbows found their flesh. Bodies piled in alleys. A few desperate folk set them ablaze to prevent the spread of contagion, but that only filled the air with noxious smoke. Mothers gave birth to stillborn babes with sunken eyes. Fathers carried their dead children to the barricades, pleading for mercy, only to be rebuffed by men in black and gold surcoats. One of those watchers, a young recruit named Tomas, had never dreamed he would kill someone who simply wanted to fetch clean water for a dying child. But that was the command. "If they breach, we risk the plague spreading further," his captain would say. "It's them or us, boy." Tomas was 19, had joined the City Watch only 6 months ago in hopes of sending his coin to his aging mother. Now, each night he huddled behind the barricade with crossbow in hand, hearing the moans and pleas from beyond. He felt ill, half from fear of the plague, half from guilt. His dreams were full of nightmares. Meanwhile, Marta the Grey became a symbol of resistance. She denounced the king's quarantine as a slaughter. She spoke of how the crown was content to let thousands die in agony rather than spend gold on cures or safe havens. She called on every able-bodied man and woman to join her cause, to rise up and tear down the barricades, and the monarchy along with them. Now that the gold cloaks had penned Flea Bottom in, she organized protests in other districts, rousing those not yet quarantined. She appealed to their fears. "When they have finished caging Flea Bottom, do you think they will stop? What happens when your street is next?" Her words echoed the dread in many hearts, especially those who had lost friends and family. The city was turning into a tinderbox, and Marta was more than ready to strike the final spark. By the 3rd month, the plague showed no sign of abating. The city's population had dropped drastically, whether from death, flight, or the forced containment of entire wards. The great September stood somber, its steps often lined with the desperate and dying. The High Septon prayed daily, but behind closed doors, he confessed to his attendants that the gods seemed to have abandoned the capital. Some of the faith militant, newly reformed a few years prior, began to show sympathy for Marta's cause. Others remained staunchly loyal to the king, believing that chaos was the work of the stranger, testing the city's faith. The schism within the faith only added to the confusion. Another wave of violence erupted when a group of small folk, emboldened by Marta, attacked one of the barricades around Flea Bottom. They approached from the outside, brandishing clubs and stolen arms, shouting for the release of their brethren. The Goldcloaks met them with a volley of crossbow bolts. The attackers scattered, but not before a dozen lay dead. That evening, Marta appeared at a clandestine rally in the Dragon Pit ward, flanked by a handful of masked figures who were rumored to be ex-Goldcloaks themselves. She declared that the time for half measures was done. The king and his council must be overthrown at once, the barricades torn down. She promised that once the tyrant was gone, the plague would be confronted by the people's unity, by the will of the gods. Desperate men and women believed her because she was the only one offering hope. The next dawn, King's Landing awoke to find the city watch on high alert. Patrols roved every major street. The king, alerted to the scale of discontent, decided to project strength. Trumpeters sounded from the Red Keep, announcing that any found conspiring against the crown would face immediate execution. The threat was intended to cow the small folk, but it only hardened their resolve. For each trumpeted warning, another rumor spread that the king's men had murdered an innocent to maintain their grip on power. Resentment festered in every corner. Within the Red Keep, the king's council was at each other's throats. Lord Tiber insisted they do something more humane. Open a portion of the barricades under heavy supervision, bring in healers, distribute clean water, show the city they were not monsters. But the commander of the city watch refused, citing the risk of spreading the plague further. Maesters who had some knowledge of quarantines argued that if Flea Bottom were unlocked, the entire city could be consumed in a new wave of infections. Others said that was already happening, that the plague showed no sign of respecting the barricades. The king, weary and indecisive, listened to these contradictory pieces of advice with a face like carved stone. He offered no final verdict, deferring each time, and the council's arguments stretched for hours. That same night, an understrength patrol of Goldcloaks was overwhelmed near the Street of the Sisters. Word traveled that Marta's men had used the vantage of the rooftops, raining stones and slung shot upon the watch until they retreated. Then they dragged the watchmen who remained behind into the alleys. One watchman staggered back to the garrison hours later, delirious and wounded, babbling that he had seen the rest of his squad beheaded. This story, once confirmed, threw the Red Keep into a furor. The king demanded swift vengeance, but no one knew precisely where Marta's forces were based. She appeared and vanished at will, and with each day, the city's labyrinthine streets offered her more safe harbors. It was in this climate of fear and rage that the Archmaester from Old Town finally arrived. He was an elderly man named Archmaester Benathon, famous for having studied diseases of the Summer Isles. He came with an entourage of novices, apothecaries, and wagons of medicinal supplies. The king's guard escorted him to the Red Keep in secret to avoid drawing the attention of the crowds. Once there, the Archmaester set to work, analyzing the plague as best he could. He took samples of sputum, examined corpses, documented the onset and progression of symptoms. If he was shocked by the scale of suffering, he did not show it openly. Instead, he gave the king a measured assessment. The disease was virulent, lethal, and possibly waterborne or airborne, transmitted easily through coughing, dirty water, and contact with the infected. His recommendation was immediate, strict quarantine of the entire city, plus a systematic cleansing of the streets and distribution of fresh water from outside sources. The city must lock itself down, he said, and that includes the Red Keep, the ports, everything. Only then can we isolate the contagion and burn it out. But imposing a full lockdown on King's Landing seemed a nightmare. Many on the council believed it would trigger unstoppable revolt. Shutting the ports would starve the city. Blocking all gates would do the same. Yet the Archmaester insisted it was the only proven method in such catastrophic plagues. The king was torn. He paced the council chamber long into the night, ringed by exhausted councillors who argued in hushed or frantic tones. In the end, the king hesitated too long. For while he debated how best to preserve the city's health and avoid rebellion, Marta the Grey and her followers were already in motion. The next day, near midday, the Red Keep's courtyard was alive with commotion as the king's guard prepared for a rumored attack. Marta's people had called for a citywide uprising, urging the small folk to converge near the barricades around Flea Bottom. A throng of men and women, many sick themselves, gathered in the streets. They carried makeshift weapons: farming scythes, hammers, broken spears, pitchforks, knives. Some had only their fists. They pressed toward the barricades, chanting curses at the watch. The Goldcloaks stationed there loosed a warning volley of bolts above their heads. The crowd, instead of fleeing, roared in anger. One of Marta's lieutenants, a former Sellsword named Herrick, shouted for them to charge. The wave of desperate small folk surged forward. The Goldcloaks reloaded and fired again, this time not aiming high. Men and women toppled, screeching, but the crowd kept coming. Soon, the barricade was under assault from the outside by the mob, and from the inside by those quarantined in Flea Bottom who saw their chance for escape. With axes and hammer blows, they hacked at the wooden beams. The Goldcloaks fought back, stabbing through gaps, kicking away hands that clawed at them, but the mass of people seemed endless. They had little to lose and a fury fueled by months of suffering. As the barricade groaned and threatened to give way, more Goldcloaks arrived in squads, directed by their captain. A brutal melee ensued. Bodies began to pile, blood soaking into the dusty earth. Shouts and screams mingled with the thunder of weapons. On the rooftops, archers among the rebels loosed arrows into the ranks of the Watch. The Watch responded with savage discipline, but they were outnumbered. At the same time, in 3 other districts of the city, more uprisings flared, apparently coordinated. Bells rang out near the Great September, but no one could discern if it was the faith militant or rebels. The city watch in that quarter had to contend with a mob that set an entire row of storehouses ablaze to draw them away. Chaos reigned. Runners from each district sprinted through the streets to try to relay news, but many never made it. In the Red Keep, the king stood in his solar, staring out the window at the columns of smoke rising beyond the walls. He could hear faint echoes of battle. A handful of lords pressed him. "We must send the King's Guard, your grace, and all the forces we have." Others warned that leaving the keep with too few defenders was foolhardy. The king clenched his jaw. The city he was meant to protect had turned into a cauldron of plague and revolt. He gave the order to dispatch a portion of the royal garrison under the command of his cousin, the commander of the Watch. "Crush this revolt swiftly," he commanded. "Show them the crown still has teeth." The king's cousin led several hundred men out of the keep, cavalry and foot soldiers alike, and marched toward Flea Bottom's barricades. Streets that should have been thronged with curious onlookers were deathly deserted. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Only the plague-ridden dared wander, many coughing up dark sputum as they clutched knives or clubs, waiting to see if the crown's men would pass them by. At the main thoroughfare leading down toward Flea Bottom, the king's cousin found one of the rebel forces, a ragtag band of at least 1,000 small folk. They were disorganized but numerous, and their rage made them fearless. He had his men form ranks and advance. The gold and scarlet banner of the throne fluttered at the forefront. On a better day, the sight might have cowed peasants, but these were no ordinary peasants. These were people who had lost kin to plague, who had been caged or threatened, who felt they had nothing left but fury. At their front stood Marta the Grey herself, cloak tattered around her, a staff in hand. She called out in a ringing voice, "Down with the tyrant! Down with the false king!" Her words were echoed by the masses. The king's cousin raised his sword and ordered the charge. Horses thundered forward. Knights lowered their lances. The rebels braced. Some scattered, but others stood firm. The cavalry crashed into them, and men and women were thrown aside, trampled or skewered by lances. Screams tore through the dust-choked air. Then the second wave of the king's men on foot waded into the fray. Steel clashed with crude blades and clubs. In the chaos, Marta was nearly unhorsed by a sweeping blow from a knight, but Herrick, the former Sellsword, managed to interpose his steel and deflect the blow. Blood and dirt mingled in a frenzy under the scorching sun. The king's cousin rode among his men, urging them onward, determined to scatter the rebels. For a time, it seemed they had the advantage of discipline, armor, and weaponry. Slowly but surely, they began pushing the rebels back. But the rebels had cunning. They knew the alleys, the hidden paths, the vantage points from rooftops. As the knights pressed forward, small groups of rebels flanked them, dropping stones or lighting flasks of oil that they hurled onto the cavalry. Horses shrieked as flames licked their flanks. Knights were forced to dismount to avoid the chaos. At close range, the outnumbered crown's men found themselves facing a swarm of desperate foes. Even as the king's cousin tried to rally his men, plague-ridden peasants lunged at them, coughing spittle flecked with blood. Some watchers later claimed these plague-ridden attackers were hoping to infect the king's men, spitting in their faces before being cut down. Others said they were just too delirious to care. In any event, it was a horror seldom seen on a battlefield. The living fighting side by side with the half-dead. The stench was overpowering, the press of bodies suffocating. Marta spied the king's cousin in the throng, recognized him by the silver filigree on his helm. She thrust her staff forward, calling, "There lies the cowardly blood of the crown." She whipped her followers into a frenzy, urging them to surround him. They battered his horse, jabbed at his flank. 2 knights rushed to protect him, swords flashing. Herrick dueled one knight in a brief flurry of blows, steel meeting steel. The second knight swung wildly at Marta, who ducked and rapped his knee with her staff. He stumbled, but another rebel took advantage and sank a dagger beneath his gorget. The king's cousin, seeing the tide turning, sounded the horn for a strategic withdrawal, intending to regroup. But the rebels pressed them. The once organized ranks of the king's men began to dissolve under the sheer brutality of the assault. There were simply too many rebels, and they were fighting with the desperation of those who believed death was certain either way. The king's cousin himself took a blow to the shoulder that staggered him. His loyal retainer tried to haul him onto a fresh horse. In the swirl of dust and gore, no one could see clearly which side was winning or losing. Bodies littered the ground, friend and foe alike. At the barricades, the fighting was no less savage. The watchers there had not received reinforcements because so many of the city's forces were deployed elsewhere. Freed from immediate threat, the rebels battered the barricades until they collapsed in a hail of splinters. From within Flea Bottom, the quarantined men and women poured out like a human tide. Some sick, some healthy, all furious. The Goldcloaks found themselves quickly overrun. Those that could fled. Others were surrounded. Some threw down their arms, begging for mercy, but the rebel crowd had precious little left to give. As night fell, King's Landing was in the grip of pandemonium. Fires sprang up in multiple districts. Thick, choking smoke curled into the sky. Armed mobs roamed the streets, smashing windows, dragging out anyone they believed loyal to the crown. Noble houses that had the misfortune to be beyond the Red Keep's walls found themselves besieged. Men in mail hammered at their gates, demanding they hand over food, supplies, or themselves. The plague raged on in the background, as unstoppable as ever, but overshadowed by the delirium of revolt. Inside the Red Keep, the king gathered what forces remained under his direct command. The castle gates were sealed. The walls bristled with archers, anxious to repel any attempt at a breach. Torchlight flickered against the red stone. The king's retinue, a handful of lords, knights, and maesters, stood in the throne room, where the Iron Throne loomed ominously in the gloom. Even here, the air felt charged with dread. The king looked upon those assembled. He saw fear in their eyes, but also the faint glimmer of resolve. He cleared his throat and addressed them in a low voice. "We are besieged from all sides," he said. "The plague devours the city. The rebels batter at our gates. This was never how I imagined my reign. The times have turned dark indeed. But if we lose hope, the realm is lost." A knight stepped forward, battered from an earlier skirmish. "Your Grace, we can still stand. The Red Keep is strong. We have enough men to hold for a time. But do we have a plan to quell this uprising for good?" The king looked to his master of whispers, who shook his head regretfully. "Word from the field is that our forces are scattered. We cannot rely on them to regroup quickly. Many have deserted. Many are dead. It might be possible to negotiate, but Marta and her followers have demanded your abdication." A hush fell over the chamber. The king's hand clenched around the pommel of his sword. "I will not abdicate at the whim of a rabble-rouser," he hissed. "We will defend this keep, gather our loyal men, and retake the city street by street, if need be. If the rebels do not yield, they will burn." The master of whispers inclined his head. "As your Grace commands, we will attempt to muster reinforcements and loyal bannermen from the outlying areas. It may take time, but we shall send riders before the city is fully encircled." In truth, time was a luxury the king did not have. The plague was rumored to kill in a matter of days once symptoms appeared. Many inside the Red Keep worried that one infected rebel, or even a well-meaning servant, might slip inside the gates and bring death among them. The tension was thick enough to taste. Outside, the fighting raged for days, with no decisive victor. Rebels rampaged through the city, some groups led by Marta, others led by opportunists who cared little for her cause but saw a chance to loot. The city watch collapsed as a cohesive force. Pockets of loyal goldcloaks barricaded themselves in watchtowers or guardhouses, awaiting orders that never came. Meanwhile, plague-stricken men and women continued to spread disease in every direction. Corpses lay unburied. Rats feasted freely. The smell of death and smoke hung over every district. Marta, for her part, pushed on. With Herrick at her side, she aimed to break the last bastion of the king's power, the Red Keep. But she knew that assaulting its high walls would be a monumental task, especially with archers stationed along the battlements. She also knew the city was running out of food. If she starved the keep, perhaps that would force the king to surrender. So Marta directed her followers to seize granaries, storehouses, bakeries, and any source of provisions. She posted guards at each location, flying a makeshift banner of a gray cloak on a spear. She demanded that the city's merchants swear loyalty to the people's cause. Some did so out of genuine conviction, others out of fear. A new power structure began to form among the rebels, albeit a chaotic one. Meanwhile, the plague remained unstoppable, striking down friend and foe alike. Marta was not immune to its toll. She lost dozens of her most dedicated followers, who coughed themselves to death in the crowded squares. But each death fueled the rebels' hatred of the crown, blaming the monarchy for letting the disease flourish. One evening, as Marta stood in a commandeered inn near the dragon pit, she felt a sudden chill in her bones. She coughed once, twice. Her head swam with a wave of dizziness. Herrick, noticing her pallor, approached. "You should rest," he said quietly. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." She waved him off. "I have no time for rest. We are this close." She held her thumb and forefinger inches apart. "We have the city. All that remains is the keep. Once the king falls, we can bring in the help we need. The gates of the city will be ours to open or close. The Archmaester can finish his cure." Herrick frowned. "You think the Archmaester has a cure?" She shook her head. "I do not know, but he may have knowledge. Once this tyranny is undone, once the Red Keep bows to the people, we can reorder everything. We'll force the lords to give us resources, or see them cast down." Herrick noticed that her hand, clenched at her side, was trembling. He gently grasped her wrist. She was burning with fever. In that moment he felt fear, real fear, for the first time since the revolt began. If Marta fell, what would happen to the cause? She was more than a leader. She was a symbol, a voice that had stirred the entire city. Without her, the revolt might shatter into factions. "You need to see a healer," he urged. "Let me bring a maester." "No," Marta snapped, voice raw. "I won't trust the crown's dogs. There must be another who can help. A wise woman or an herbalist. Find someone. Now." Herrick obeyed, setting out into the night in search of a remedy. But the wise woman he found insisted that Marta had the plague, and that no herbs would cure it. Only rest, careful nursing, and a miracle from the gods might save her. Desperate, Herrick tried to keep her illness quiet, lest the rebels' morale falter. For a time, it worked. Marta still forced herself to appear in public, albeit briefly, galvanizing her followers with her raspy voice. At night, though, her fever raged, and her cough grew more persistent. Within days, her strength was failing. Word reached the king's council that Marta might be ill. Some scoffed, believing it a rumor or a trick. Others took it as a good sign, hoping that the rebels would lose their unifying leader. The king himself heard the news with grim satisfaction but dared not hope. He turned his thoughts to practical concerns. Could he rally loyalist forces from the countryside? Could the Red Keep hold out against a siege? The plague was inside the walls, quietly picking off guards and courtiers. Every day, more men coughed behind the ramparts, even though they tried to hide it. The Archmaester's advice remained the same. A total lockdown, rigorous isolation, better sanitation. But it was too late for that now. The revolt was in full swing. The city was fractured beyond easy repair. Days blurred into nights of flame and bloodshed. The rebels advanced toward the Red Keep in stages, attempting to dismantle outlying fortifications. Each attempt was met by volleys of arrows and boiling oil from above. The moans of the wounded merged with the hacking coughs of the plague-ridden. The city streets were choked with blackened corpses. Occasionally, a strong wind from the bay would blow the stench inland, and men would vomit in the gutters. In the midst of this horror, a rumor emerged that the king was preparing to unleash wildfire on the city's rebels if they breached the keep's gates. This rumor spread quickly, igniting terror among the small folk. Memories of the Mad King Aerys Targaryen lingered in the realm's collective consciousness, tales of how he stored wildfire beneath the city. The king, for his part, did have some stock of wildfire in the alchemist's vaults, but whether he truly intended to use it was unclear. The rumor alone was enough to prompt a heightened frenzy among Marta's followers, for they believed they had to strike quickly or risk annihilation. Marta, however, was fading. On a stormy night, though the storm was weak, only a flicker of lightning in the distance. She collapsed after delivering one of her speeches. Herrick and others carried her to a hidden cellar, where a local midwife tried to tend her with poultices of mint and rosemary. Marta drifted in and out of consciousness, her cough wet with blood. Even in her delirium, she spoke of the king's downfall, urging her people not to falter. Herrick could feel the rebellion slipping out of focus. Without her visible leadership, various factions of rebels began ignoring commands, looting what they wished or carving out personal territories. A few loyal subcommanders still believed in the cause, but none had Marta's charisma or moral authority. Meanwhile, the king seized the opportunity. If the rebel cause was fractured, he might strike a decisive blow. He dispatched riders under cover of night to bring reinforcements from local bannermen who had not yet succumbed to the plague. A small number heeded the call, sending a few hundred men. It was not an army large enough to conquer the entire city, but it might tilt the scale in key battles. The king directed these new arrivals to encircle the pockets of rebels near the Red Keep, cut off their supply routes, starve them out. Fighting intensified. Rebel outriders clashed with the king's new troops in alleyways and squares. Anyone caught in between risked being beaten or killed by both sides. The city watch tried to reassert some semblance of order, but was often overshadowed by the king's more heavily armed men. Entire neighborhoods went up in flames. Survivors claimed these fires were set deliberately to smoke out rebels or to purify the plague-ridden wards. Others said it was an accident of battle, torches knocked over, or a stray flaming arrow. No one truly knew, but the result was a city of ashes, where charred remains replaced once crowded tenements. Each new day saw more bodies, more heartbreak. The plague itself did not relent, continuing to slay men, women, and children indiscriminately. In the Dragon Pit ward, piles of corpses were left to rot, for there were too many to burn all at once. The air bristled with disease-carrying flies. Along the Blackwater, the tide washed bloated bodies ashore. The Red Keep soared above it all like a grim sentinel, its walls blackened with soot. Eventually, Marta's location was betrayed by an informer. A gold cloak who had deserted the watch early on had taken up with the rebels but lost faith once he saw that the plague spared no one. He sought a royal pardon, and in exchange, he revealed the cellar where Marta lay dying. The King's Guard made a swift raid at dawn. Herrick and a handful of rebels put up a ferocious fight, but they were overwhelmed. Herrick was slain, the rest taken or killed. Marta herself was found too weak to stand. Coughing blood, she spat defiance at the guards, calling them cowards and dogs. They dragged her out of the cellar, bound her hands, and delivered her to the Red Keep. The king ordered an immediate audience in the throne room. By now, he was worn and haunted by the horrors of the siege. When Marta was brought before him, he stared at her, seeing this once vibrant woman reduced to trembling bones, feverish sweat on her brow, dried blood on her lips. Yet her gaze still burned with rage. In a hoarse voice, she cursed him. "You let our city die," she spat. "You let the plague run rampant, caged us like animals, starved us, butchered us." The king's eyes flickered. "You incited revolt. You led thousands to their deaths," he said, though his tone was subdued. She laughed, a hollow, ragged laugh that turned into a cough. "We were dying already, your grace, and you did nothing." A hush fell. Courtiers watched, some with pity, some with cold satisfaction. The king's personal guard waited for the order. She was a traitor. She had led an insurrection. The standard punishment was death, typically by beheading or hanging. But the king hesitated. She took that moment to speak again, a hiss through her bloodied teeth. "Kill me or cure me, it does not matter. You have already lost your city." Before the king could respond, she collapsed to her knees, convulsing. A moment of shock rippled through the assembled watchers. The king nodded to his maesters, who rushed forward to check her. It was too late. She died in their arms, eyes glassy, spittle flecked with red. The plague had claimed its most famous victim. Word of Marta's death spread quickly through King's Landing. Some rebels, upon hearing it, surrendered or fled the city, believing their cause lost. Others, more fanatical, vowed to fight on in her name. But without her leadership, the revolt fractured further. The king took advantage, sending his forces to crush pockets of resistance one by one. The city watch resumed patrols with reinforcements. Over the next few weeks, street by street, the king's men reclaimed large portions of the city. Yet victory was hollow. The plague still burned through the population. In Flea Bottom and beyond, entire families lay dead. The city's infrastructure was crippled. Smoke still rose from charred ruins, and the stench of rot clung to every stone. Those who survived wandered like ghosts, pale and hollow-eyed, searching for scraps of food or for lost loved ones. Even the king's men were not spared, with entire squads succumbing to fever. At the Red Keep, the king held midnight vigils for his cousin, who had come back from battle wounded only to cough his lungs out days later. The Archmaester's efforts, while well-intentioned, could not stem the tide of sickness in such dire conditions. Eventually, the revolt was declared ended. A few ringleaders were executed publicly, their heads mounted on spikes near the city gates. The king tried to project an air of strength, promising that the plague would soon be contained, that trade would resume, that normalcy would return. But behind the scenes, the city was shattered. The cost in lives was unfathomable. Mass graves were dug outside the walls, cart after cart of bodies deposited each day. The once bustling capital was a shadow of itself, riddled with disease and haunted by the memory of bloodshed. In the aftermath, many asked who was truly responsible for so much death. Some blamed Marta for inciting violence, others blamed the king for callous neglect, still others blamed the maesters for failing to find a cure, or the faith for fueling zealotry. Countless stories circulated of heroic acts amidst the carnage. Men who risked their lives to save neighbors, women who nursed orphans, gold cloaks who refused to fire upon starving families. But these stories were drowned in the larger narrative of horror. As the seasons slowly shifted and the long, hot summer showed signs of waning, a tepid rain finally fell upon King's Landing. It mixed with the ash and grime, turning the streets into black rivulets of filth. In time, the plague receded, not because of any cure, but simply because there were fewer people left to infect. Hunger and thirst drove many survivors away from the city, leaving large portions of King's Landing abandoned. Rats ran freely in empty quarters, scuttling around rotting doors. The Red Keep, battered and smoke-stained, still housed the king and his retinue. He remained on the Iron Throne, though at times it felt like a hollow seat. In hushed corridors, courtiers spoke of how the monarchy might never fully recover its moral authority. The bond between the throne and the small folk had been severed by plague and revolt. Whatever the king said now, the people remembered the barricades, the crossbow bolts, and the unburied dead. In the quiet that followed, a new hush fell over King's Landing. But this hush was different from the one that had first heralded the plague. This hush was deeper, born of sorrow, fear, and the knowledge that everything had changed. Shops opened sporadically, lacking the joy and bustle of old. The Great September held daily rites for the departed, but even these ceremonies felt hollow when so many had been lost. Noble houses that survived tried to reassert their influence, yet the memory of the revolt lingered, an invisible presence in every alley. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, those who wandered heard strange echoes, a distant cough, the murmur of a crowd, the clang of steel, and wondered if it was the ghosts of the revolt or the plague itself haunting the city's stones. In taverns, the few drinkers left sometimes whispered the name of Marta the Grey, half in hatred, half in reverence. They said that in her last days, she believed the gods had chosen her to purge the city of a corrupt monarchy, that the plague was simply an instrument of divine wrath. But if the gods had truly intervened, no one could say what lesson they intended. The king clung to his throne, determined to hold the realm together by any means. Yet inside his private chambers, he spent sleepless nights pondering the shape of his shattered capital. He would ride through the streets, wearing a hooded cloak to hide his identity, and see the burned ruins, the faces of children scrounging for scraps, the pale men hacking and spitting in corners. He would pass the spot where his cousin had fallen, or the gate where they had mounted the heads of traitors. He carried these sights in his heart like wounds that would never heal. Slowly, day by day, the city began the long process of survival, if not outright recovery. The plague was not gone, but it ebbed. New measures for cleanliness were instituted, though haphazardly. The Archmaester oversaw the disposal of bodies more systematically. Wells were inspected and some purified. A few trade ships dared to return, lured by the promise of high prices for goods in a devastated market. Starving folk trickled back from the countryside, finding that at least in King's Landing there was some chance of coin or shelter, no matter how bleak. The king tried to placate them with tax relief and promises of improved living conditions, but these pledges rang hollow to many who had suffered. Still, the hush remained. It was a hush that reminded everyone of the plague's ferocity, the revolt's carnage, the tenuous grip that any mortal has on life and power. Some said the hush was the city's way of mourning. Others believed it was only the calm before the next storm, that a city so bloodied could never truly know peace again. In hidden corners, men and women who had followed Marta continued to hold secret gatherings. They lit small candles in her memory, recited the demands she once shouted in the squares. They told stories of how she stood against tyranny, how she was a martyr. In these gatherings, they planned for a future day when the monarchy might be challenged again, and the small folk would not stand alone. They believed that if the plague did not kill the crown, perhaps another wave of rebellion might. The King's Landing that emerged from that fateful time was a changed place, scarred beyond simple repair. The winding streets still bustled eventually. Some measure of trade and livelihood had to return. But an undercurrent of trauma ran beneath every transaction, every daily chore. People remembered how quickly the city had descended into chaos, how swiftly neighbors had turned on one another when fear ruled the day. And they remembered how a single cough could herald doom. Children who survived grew up with nightmares of men in gold cloaks fighting men in rags, of black smoke curling from rooftops, of mothers who died in their arms. They carried these nightmares into adulthood, forging a new generation both wiser and more bitter than the last. The monarchy resumed its official ceremonies, knighting loyal warriors, hosting small feasts in the Red Keep. But fewer lords attended, and no one truly forgot the price that had been paid. As the final embers of summer cooled and a gentle autumn breeze swept through the city, fallen leaves occasionally drifted across the charred remains of houses or the cracked cobblestones. The king would step onto his balcony and watch the browning leaves dance along the ramparts. The hush that lay over King's Landing was almost serene, but it was a serenity birthed from devastation, a lull in a city that had faced the twin horrors of plague and revolt. In the hearts of the survivors, hope struggled to blossom anew. Some insisted that they must rebuild better, avoid the mistakes of the past. Others said that hope was a fool's errand, and that nothing would change. Yet time does not stand still. Life, for all its cruelty, persists. Even in Flea Bottom, new families moved into the abandoned hovels, and small fires glowed in hearths once cold. Children laughed, if only for a moment, and men tried to find work among the rubble, forging new trades in a city that was half empty and riddled with ghosts. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The king never fully regained the confidence he once had, nor did the realm see him as the unchallenged figure of authority he aspired to be. But the crown endured, its power still anchored in the prestige of the Iron Throne and the loyalty of enough lords who feared anarchy more than they resented the monarchy's failings. The plague, though diminished, remained an occasional terror. People died quietly in corners, or sometimes entire families vanished behind closed doors. But it was no longer an all-consuming scourge. The revolt, too, was over, though its specter lingered in whispered tales and half-burned banners. A year after the worst of the plague, travelers entering King's Landing would find a city that was strangely quiet, as though it had seen too much suffering to return to its former tumult. The markets were open, yes, but subdued. The gold cloaks who patrolled seemed more guarded, more prone to jump at shadows. Nobles who visited stayed behind the Red Keep's walls if they could, and the king himself rarely ventured out except under heavy escort. The faith held masses for the dead, but many among the small folk now questioned the gods, for the plague had spared neither saints nor sinners. Of Marta the Grey, only hushed stories remained. Some called her a misguided fanatic whose revolt worsened the city's agony. Others spoke of her as a champion of the downtrodden, undone by a ruthless king and an unforgiving disease. The memory of her speeches lingered in alleyways and at the foot of the dragon pit, where the wind would sometimes carry the faint echoes of a crowd's roar. But for most, survival was a more pressing concern than ideology. They had learned how quickly the city could devour them, and the plague had taught them a new brand of caution. Yet even caution cannot only banish the hunger for change. In the battered remains of Flea Bottom, you might still find an old crone who says that the city will rise again, that another champion will come to finish what Marta began, or that the king's line will wither when next the gods unleash their wrath. And so King's Landing stands in this uneasy twilight, half in ruin, half in reconstruction, bearing the scars of a plague-fueled revolt that showed how thin the veneer of order can be. Those scars would never fully fade, and in the hush that settled over King's Landing, one could almost hear the lament of all the souls claimed by sickness and strife, and the whispered question of whether the city might one day break free from an endless cycle of tyranny, disease, and blood. The hush answered with the faintest stirring of wind, as though the ghosts of the fallen were left to sigh among the rubble, waiting for the day the living might finally learn from the ashes of their forebears.